Good evening and welcome to Education Matters. It's Tuesday, the 6th of March, and if you're watching live at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 6th of March, this program is repeated at several times during the week. But if you're watching live now at 6 p.m., the phone-in number is 603-640-3091. First of all, I have to apologise to some of the people I told we were having Dr. Vargas on the show tonight, and it turns out that last week we had to change that date, and he's actually going to be here now on April the 6th. So I'm sorry if I misinformed people about the fact that he would be on here tonight to answer questions, but as I said, we'll have him in a week or so. In breaking news tonight, just about tomorrow, because we have some weather coming in, and it's said that it may last through Thursday, but the Manchester School District has announced just a while ago that tomorrow will be early dismissal. So not early opening, early closing tomorrow. There'll be early, and so the middle schools will be closing at 12 noon. Elementary and high schools will be closing at 12:53 p.m. And again, this is for Wednesday, the 7th of March. So middle schools will close at noon, elementary and high schools at 12:53. The Manchester School of Technology (CTE) and high school will close at 11:40. All half-day and full-day preschool is cancelled for tomorrow, and all after-school and evening activities, including athletics, are cancelled also. So if you're so whatever plans you have for tomorrow, one of them needs to include picking up kids, etc. early in the day. Again, middle school's 12 o'clock, elementary and high school's 12:53, and then Manchester School of Technology at 11:40. Half-day and full-day preschool is cancelled, and school and evening activities are cancelled. So, and then just by looking at the weather, I'd be surprised if it is as bad as they claim it might be. We could end up having an effect on Thursday morning too. But that's the latest there. So, given that I was planning on having Dr. Vargas here tonight, and through no fault of his rather than mine, in forgetting the dates have been changed, I'm left with a couple of things that, first of all, I'd be happy if you're called in. 640-3091. The first thing tonight was I just happened to be on the issue of the reaction to what happened in Parkland, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this show because I'm sure people have discussed this at great length on in other forums, but today the House of Representatives in Concord once again showed its true colours. You know, a very Republican administration or house in Florida at least put forward a bill on banning bump stocks and changing the age for accessing or being allowed to buy weapons from 18 to 21, and made some other changes. In New Hampshire, a proposal was put forward today to including those things, and it didn't even get to the floor. So it's not as though people voted for or against it. It's just that the Republican majority decided that they didn't want to take any vote on it. So for those of you who like that, then you're getting what you paid for and what you voted for. For those of you who think that reasonable voices should prevail, and that at very least that the people of New Hampshire's representatives should at least discuss and then vote on whether we should ban bump stocks or whether we should increase the age for legally buying a gun from 18 to 21, or some of the other measures that might be discussed. Then you should know that in the state of New Hampshire, no such luck. That's not going to be discussed, and I have increasing levels of anxiety about Concord and the votes being taken in Concord. And since this is education matters, I concentrate on matters educational, and it is just it is when you look at what's happening with School Bill SB 193, which is the privatization bill or the voucher bill. Some people who support it would call it the school choice bill. So this thing has become a complete it's a mess. It's been chopped and bitten at and chewed, and it's always been a struggle to get it. The whole thing should be scrapped and eliminated because at its foundation it is simply a thinly guised attack on public education. And there may be a few people who believe that it is a real, that the real issue here is to give people more choice. But I think it's very plain to see that the very people who support this idea of taking public funds and allowing it to be spent in private schools, you will never hear these people advocating for a robust, well-funded, competent public school system in the state of New Hampshire. They don't express concern. Starting from the very apex of the pyramid, Mr. Edelblut, who I don't mean to demonize, Mr. Edelblut is clearly has an ideological agenda, and is implementing his agenda insofar as he can as the Secretary for Education. Governor Chris Sununu, who in terms of education is a wolf in sheep's clothing because he would purport to be, he describes Mr. Edelblut as more of a manager, that he's there to sort of manage things. Well, Chris Sununu went out and got Andrew Klein, formerly of the Union Leader, infamously an editorial writer there, and who was with the Josiah Bartlett Institute, a well-known, and if you're far right-wing, respected right-wing think tank or libertarian think tank in the state of New Hampshire, and brought him in and made him chairman of the state school board. So now you have a Secretary of Education who has 7 children, all of whom are homeschooled, which in one sense is very commendable, right? I've nothing against the fact if he is an able gentleman and has the wherewithal and et cetera to educate his children and does it well, then kudos to him. But that's his experience of education, and he comes into the State Department of Education with this view about not to add to that which is there already. His idea of addition is to not enhance the offerings of the public schools that are there already, but rather that this notion that our public schools somehow have failed some of our students, and therefore we need private schools and religious schools to take up the slack, and that they would do a better job. Now, the fact is that there is no data to support that. That's a political view and an ideological view, not an educational view. The fundamental problem is that schools in the state of New Hampshire are in many towns and cities woefully funded. And to that point, there's a piece that was in the I think it's the piece in the Concord Monitor. I'm just going to look to the side here, that from today actually. And its current education funding model subsidizes wealthy communities. So this is talking about how uneven our education is today. And if you've grown up in it and you're used to it and you don't believe in questioning it, then I guess you can accept it sort of as it is. But anybody who looks at education in the state of New Hampshire and says that the state offers an adequate education, a reasonable education, and an equal opportunity to its students, regardless of race, creed, gender, etc., that clearly is not the case. I don't think anybody could make that claim. I don't hear people making that claim. The issue is just not spoken about. So the fact that a wealthier town, perhaps on the seacoast of New Hampshire, will spend $30,000 or $32,000 per year on its students, many in the 20s of thousands, and then a city like Manchester spends 12, with all sources of funding, including federal, state, and everything else. That's sort of accepted. And if you go up to Coos County and you look at poorer towns in the northern end of the state that have to struggle greatly to supply the minimum education possible to their students, pay their teachers the absolute minimum they barely can, that there's a huge inequality, inequity between children in one town in the state compared to the next. Now, you may say that that's the luck of the draw. I was born into a wealthy family. I've got a nice house in a nice town. Therefore, I get a great education. So we can compound the problem that came from a previous education. I'll have better teachers. I'll have nicer classrooms. I'll have better technology. I'll have more programs offered to me, besides all the comforts of home I have anyway. And that's just the way it ought to be. And the state will rubber stamp that and allow that to happen. So one of this article in the Concord today, the Concord Monitor newspaper today says, New Hampshire education funding model is subsidising the state's wealthiest communities by allowing them to retain the excess state taxes that they raise, according to the Concord Monitor editorial board. There are many troubling side stories to the way New Hampshire pays for education. Representative Paul Henley, a Concord Democrat, is trying to address one of them with House Bill 1802, which would alter one aspect of the statewide property tax. So communities collect property taxes, and part of those property taxes are for education purposes. What House Bill 1802 would change the way in which that money was distributed to the towns, and it explains it here. So more than 40 towns in the state, and there are about 180 or 170 or so towns or school districts, more than 40 towns collected more than they are due to receive from the state in education adequacy aid, for a total surplus of $29.7 million, so roughly $30 million. So let's say the town of X, based on the number of children it has, would have gotten a certain number of dollars from the state, because of the amount of tax that they are able to raise, because they are property wealthy towns. They collect more money than that adequacy amount. What happens under current law is the state allows that town to keep that money. What this bill would say is that if you're a wealthy town, whatever people pay in property taxes across the state towards education, that's education funding, and it's state tax dollars collected through the localities, and that money should be distributed across the on a per capita, on a per head basis to students across the state, rather than what happens today. What happens today is that when the towns collect more than they would have received in adequacy grants from the state, they get to keep the surplus. So the 40 richer towns collect a total of $30 million more than they would get in adequacy aid, and they're just allowed to keep it. So, for example, New London collected $2,555,000 through the tax, but required only $1,161,000 for adequacy aid, leaving them in excess of $1.4 million that under the current law the town's allowed to keep. Henley points out that the money collected is a state tax, and therefore any surplus belongs to the state's education trust fund, not in the bank account of the town that collected the tax on the state's behalf. And according to the Concord Monitor's editorial board, they believe he's correct. House Bill 1802 would end the practice during a 4-year phase-in period. In year one, the towns would remit 25% of the surplus, followed by 50% in year 2, 75% in year 3, and 100% in year 4. The bottom line is that these 40-plus towns with a median property tax rate of $13.19 are collecting aid above and beyond the amount established by lawmakers. The money should not be theirs to keep. Unfortunately, the House Ways and Means Committee didn't see it that way last month and voted 15-6 to kill the bill as inexpedient to legislate. In a letter to the committee, the town of Newington wrote, not a poor town, wrote, each community should be carrying their own educational cost and cutting other budget items as necessary to ensure a proper education for their school children. Each town and city should be responsible for their own expenses, or home rule no longer exists. Well, as is pointed out here, home rule, New Hampshire isn't a home rule state to start with. But think about that, the rationale for it. I understand it, it's very logical. But basically that's saying, look, we're a rich town, we don't want to contribute to anybody else. We happen to be attached to this state for one purpose and another, but we've got no interest in, helping our fellow New Hampshireites. In other words, there is really no such thing as a New Hampshireite. It's every man for himself. The same logic goes back to, I only want to pay for those services that I use, and I don't have any obligation to a city or a town, people in my town who might require services that I don't need. So I'm not elderly, I shouldn't have to pay for the cash centre. I've got my own load of books at home, I don't need to go to the library, I shouldn't have to pay for the library. I don't own a property in the city of Manchester, so I don't care about fire. I just happen to live here, so I don't want to pay for fire department. I don't know if that works that well. I'm a law-abiding citizen, and I've got 14 guns at home. I'm going to protect myself. I don't want to pay for the fire department. I don't drive on Maple Street, so I don't want to pay for the potholes there. I don't live on the west side, so I don't care if there are potholes over there. My kid doesn't go to West High School, so I don't care if the stadium over there needs resurfacing or not. It's the same thinking. So just like Manchester's either a city of one or it's not a community at all, then the state of New Hampshire is one community or it's not a community at all. And the argument made by Newington, and it's self-serving, and I understand, how logical it is. I just believe that they're wrong. According to the monitor here, it goes on to say, we understand the argument from Newington, but New Hampshire is not a home rule state. Cities and towns have only the power granted to them by the legislature and governor. Education is a state responsibility, and a tax is a state tax, not a local tax. By allowing some communities to retain the surplus, the state is essentially subsidizing a select group of towns, which leaves taxpayers in other communities to make up the difference. So when you think about it that way and just change your way of looking at it, it looks very unfair. And with the state facing so many challenges that require more funding, the $30 million or so could do a lot more good in the state coffers. When the full House takes up the bill, House Bill 1802 next week, and they urge lawmakers to do what is best for the people of New Hampshire and move the legislation forward, the statewide property tax is a state tax, so the state ought to collect it. The fact that it's done through the town is neither here nor there. Now, another article in which is similar to this in the Concord Monitor today is, let me see, it is reliance on property taxes for funding means large differences in experiences and outcomes in New Hampshire schools. So this is to give you an idea of, we often look at things through the lens of Manchester, which of course spends less per student than everybody else and has a higher number of students per teacher than anybody else, or had last year. We'll see what will happen next year. So schools in New Hampshire rely on local property taxes for their funding. That means that some wealthier towns, like for instance Bow, have more resources to pay competitive salaries to teachers and offer more programs like AP, advanced placement courses, and electives. But other towns, many of which don't have high property values, struggle with a lack of funding. The Concord Monitor compared Bow and Pittsfield, two New Hampshire towns with very different circumstances. So this is just, you can do this. This is not, shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It's just usually it's not spoken about, or we just take it all for granted that, the poor people in, I don't know, wherever it might be, Somersworth or wherever it might be, will have a certain standard of education, and people in Bow or Windham will have a different standard of education. 20 miles away from Bow, the schools of Bow, an affluent suburban community bordering Concord, have always enjoyed a sterling reputation for academic success and good pay for educators, where teachers earn an average of $63,169 a year, substantially more than the average in Manchester, for instance. But if they're comparing it to Pittsfield, 20 miles away, which is nothing in nowadays, the schools in Pittsfield, a geographically isolated depressed former Milltown have faced test scores and graduation rates well below average. Excuse me. There, in Pittsfield, teachers are paid on average $22,000 a year less than Bow. So teachers in Bow get paid on average $41,000 a year, and in Bow $63,000 a year. That's a 50% increase. If I'm earning $42,000 in Pittsfield, I can drive 20 miles down the street and get a 50% pay increase on average by just going to Bow. So I'm going to go to Bow, right? While the district has a contingent of veteran staff, that's Pittsfield, it faces high turnover, sometimes up to 20% a year, and a steady churn of young, untried teachers. So whatever the solution may be, just recognizing the problem is important. There's a clearly documented example of where there's a problem in the town of Pittsfield. When you compare it to Bow, clearly the kids of Pittsfield are disadvantaged. And we as a community can either say, well, to hell with it, that's just the way it is. Their parents should have worked harder. They should have gone to better schools. They should have bought a house someplace else. We don't owe the kids of Pittsfield anything as New Hampshireites. We just use this word New Hampshire people as kind of it doesn't mean anything because we don't look after each other. There's no symbiosis here. There's no equal opportunity here. It's every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. So one kid here says that, so a steady churn of young, untried teachers. We lost our whole English department last year. It was just me left. So you lost your 7th and 8th grade teacher, your 9th and 10th grade teacher, and our literacy interventionist. Well, that position was cut, said the 11th and 12th grade English teacher, Jenny Wellington. So everybody in the high school English department in Pittsfield is eliminated in 1 year. Not eliminated. One person's eliminated, the others choose to leave, and so that's and this happens regularly. It's saying here, New Hampshire's property tax dependent way of funding its schools offers plenty of easy eye-popping contrasts. Eye-popping contrasts. Exactly, because there are so many places when you look at the difference between one town and another and the opportunities for kids in one area as opposed to another. And in the end, we can never make it all perfect. It's never going to be all equal, but pretending that somehow, when I listen to people like Mr. Edelblut and Andrew Klein talking about we've got to, our priority, which they've spent now, the year of the Sununu administration, concentrating on ways to extract money from public education, bring in private administrative companies to take 5% of the money being hived out so they can get paid to manage it, and then find solutions that are untried and unknown, and bring people out to homeschooling. Let's say that those solutions might actually be solutions someday, and I won't grant that, but let's say they are. Why is there no conversation about the inequalities that I'm pointing out here? Why are a whole town full of students? How is it at all the problem in Pittsfield that what we need there is a private school or a religious school? No, we don't. We have a problem that the taxpayers of Pittsfield, because they're a property poor town, can't afford to pay any more, and so we shouldn't have to. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. These inequalities shouldn't exist. But let me go on with the article here. So. Plenty eye-popping contrast. Compare, for example, scenic seacoast municipalities who spend thousands above the state average per pupil, but do so for single-digit property tax rates, while poor rural centres in Coos County face staggering tax rates while spending far less per student. So when it comes in terms of the tax burden on people in poor communities, because of the way we manage our taxes in New Hampshire, remember, it's our choice. We don't have an income tax, we don't have a sales tax, we don't have a flat tax. So we have designed a system that builds in these terrible, unconscionable, indefensible differences between the experience of some of our children and others. And in the end, my first claim is to say we are not giving the children of New Hampshire the opportunity they deserve in order to be successful. And because we're not doing that, then we're going to affect the economic outlook and of our future and our state, etc. A close look at two capital area districts, Bow and Pittsfield, underlines the importance of property wealth. But it also emphasises how other factors, community affluence, size, geography, can influence what resources students have and how well they do. With wages substantially below the state average teacher pay of $57,552, Manchester is below that number, by the way, for average salary. The district is at a disadvantage, that's the Pittsfield is, when trying to attract the most qualified staff. Only 39% of Pittsfield's teachers have a master's degree, while 69% of Bow's teachers do. That's almost 2 to 1. And in the end, that means something. The biggest influence on how well a student is going to do is having a well-trained, qualified, and motivated teacher at the top of the classroom. That's the single most important thing. And I was listening to Bill Shea, Alderman Bill Shea, speaking at an automatic meeting last month, and he made this point. And in his case, he was arguing against class size being the major. He always goes back to when he was teaching in the 1950s or 60s or whatever, and that class sizes were larger, etc. And he made the point, and I agree with him. I don't agree with the class size is not important, but he made the point that having highly qualified, motivated, capable teachers is the single most important thing. And I agree 100%. So when you have a pay differential of 50% between Pittsfield and Bow over a 20-mile distance, when you have almost twice, 39% as opposed to, 1.5 times, more master's degree teachers in Bow than you do in Pittsfield, you shouldn't be surprised at outcomes. Most people leave because of the pay. This is just the fact. When you don't pay your teachers well, it becomes a training ground for new teachers. And they can get a year or two under their belt, and then they can go to another school, Wellington said. More importantly, it's also made a big difference in how long the district can retain teachers. For kids, a teacher's experience is painfully obvious. So even the kids know a new teacher from a teacher with experience. Here's Bow Jr. Jason Howe, his blunt take on it. He said about teachers, the ones that have been here forever are the best teachers. The new ones aren't as good. Now, by implication, I don't fully buy into that because they're not as good. I think I would interpret that as meaning they're not as good because they're not as experienced. They may, after a couple of years, be very good, but when you walk into a classroom for the first time as a new teacher, you don't have all the skills that you're going to have down the road in a couple of years. Colby Wolf, another kid, a junior in Pittsfield, would tend to agree. She says, or he, I'm not sure if it's a she or a he, Colby Wolf. The teachers that come here for a year are just here to get their feet wet and then they move on because either the budget gets them or a better job comes up. I don't want to be mean about that, but it's happened to a lot of teachers, he said. Conversely, those teachers who stuck around often receive glowing reviews. Almost all of the teachers that have been here for a long time, it's like their passion, he says. This school is their passion, said Autumn Colin Pagan, a fellow Pittsfield junior. The turnover is also a drag on the teachers that do stay behind and who say it badly stymies forward progress. In your team, you lose somebody or two people or even three or even four. You're starting over from scratch, trying to catch people up. That's time, energy spent catching people up instead of moving forward, said Pittsfield physical education teacher Rick Anthony. When Pittsfield's teachers walk out the door, they don't just take their newfound expertise. Deciding it would be the best way to create long-term changes with temporary dollars, the district sank the bulk of its grants into professional development, trying to overcome this unfairness that exists to start with. While Bow has a bevy of in-house offerings, especially at the higher level, a slew of advanced placement classes, So, and when you go to advanced placement classes in high school, ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful, and we're lucky here in Manchester to have advanced place classes at our high schools here in Manchester. We sadly don't have a gifted and talented program, but then we have lots of programs that we don't have. But it means that when your child goes to university, that's a course they won't have to take, so they can graduate early or pay a little less. And that's an important thing. So while Bohs of Bayview House offers especially higher level advanced placement classes, they have advanced placement and they have electives like engineering and metal smithing. There are 4 foreign languages at Bow High School. Pittsfield relies almost entirely on online classes for AP advanced placement and dual enrollment courses. So almost all of it is online. I'm an in-class student. Online is not my forte, Colby said. And this goes on. There's more to be seen about this. But my point is, what's clearly to be seen and clearly obvious is that there's not equal opportunity for students across the state of New Hampshire. And while this is going on, we have a state secretary of education and a chairman of a state school board, both of whom are preoccupied with the ideological outlook around let's have private enterprise come in, both private enterprise and religious schools come in and be part of the solution here in New Hampshire, and not just be part of the solution, which is fine. They've existed from time immemorial. There are wonderful Catholic schools and other schools in the state of New Hampshire. I have nothing against them whatsoever. Good for them. But they don't need to be, nor should they be, subsidized by public dollars, especially in a school system that doesn't have what is necessary to give their kids an adequate education. And all the school bill 193 is going to do is exacerbate that problem. So now we look at the numbers, and there's a series of numbers that have come out of the Finance Committee for School Bill 193 in the last week or so. And for those in Manchester who were saying they didn't know how it might affect a school or a school system, we have some good numbers now that show that, depending on which scenario we go with, in the first year between $640,000 and $880,000 as a minimum in the city of New Hampshire. So $600,000 is 12 teachers to the city of Manchester. That's what that would cost. Now the bill has all kinds of amendments to it. It's been chipped and chopped and changed around again to squeeze it, shoehorn it into a place where it would have no budget impact. Because the budget impact is now going to be borne by local school boards and local taxpayers, and not by the state. And the whole thing, ladies and gentlemen, at its face is just a terrible idea. And they have turned around and done things like lowered. Now they're talking about the only people who'd be allowed to apply for these grants, at least initially, will be people now receiving free and reduced lunch. That's come down from having no barrier as to who could get the money. In other words, the richest millionaire in the state of New Hampshire, who's already sending their kids to some Phillips Exeter or Dairyfield, would be able to take taxpayers' money paid for by you and me and have their rich son Johnny who subsidize his education using that taxpayer money. Well, we have kids languishing in schools in the state without the resources they need, with large classrooms and a lack of facilities, etc. So the whole thing makes no sense unless you start to understand it in terms of ideology. And if your whole stance is that public education, now we've seen this, right? And some of those who support these actions have been open in the past about their belief that public education is not a public good, that the schools are ungodly, that they are that they are places of indoctrination, that that the government can do nothing right, that true to the most outlandish view, which is that I've heard, which is that, and this, as you may have heard me say before, came from elected representatives in the state of New Hampshire, not from some guy who's drunk in the corner of a pub, dribbling down his beer down his chin, but rather somebody up in Concord, or people up in Concord, who said that public education is an unconstitutional exercise of government, and that therefore they don't believe in public education at all. So I just want to call a spade because there are too many people around the table who don't want to recognize that there are people whose ideological perspective is that that there is no public good to public education, and that we need to dismantle the system. And you start at that maybe on one end of the spectrum, then we come all the way back through, public schools can't do it as well as private can, and all the other arguments, we can't afford it, whatever you come right back along the spectrum until you get to some reasonable people back towards the centre someplace who might say it's only reasonable that there be school choice, and that parents should have the option, if they don't like the public school system, to send their kids to an alternative education opportunity. That's reasonable. I don't support it, but at least that's reasonable. But I don't want to pretend for a minute that all the sort of the lunatic fringe isn't part of that argument at all. Because in the end, this idea that some of the people that I've heard who have by no means all, but some of the people I've heard who have withdrawn their kids from public education, they get into an argument with the administration. And the argument might be, I've heard people argue about the fact that they didn't like the homework requirement. I remember a classic argument in one school where there was a fire drill, and during the fire drill, there were some boys who were like seventh graders, and when you have a fire drill, the kids get into a line and they have to exit the school. And first of all, they have to be silent doing it. You have to be silent. They're seventh grade after all, 12, 13 years old. They're told to be silent. They exit the school in a expeditiously, quickly, orderly fashion, and go to their assembly place. And so there's a couple of kids in one of our schools one day, and this is not a particularly important example, but it's an idea. It'll give you an idea of the kind of stuff that happens and how parents go off the rails. And so a couple of kids are talking and joking around. They're not the worst kids in the world. Wonderful pair, nice people, but nice kids. I know these kids, but they're laughing and joking around during a fire drill. And so the principal says, you're staying after school. Tomorrow, the teacher reports and says, Mr. X and Mr. Y, were laughing and joking around during the fire drill, so they're sent down to the office. The principal says, okay, boys, this is were you? They say, yes, we were. They say, okay, you're on detention after school tomorrow and for 2 days this week. Wednesday and Thursday afternoon, you'll be here. Instead of going home at 2, you're going to go home at 3:30 or 3 o'clock, whatever it is. Okay, mom or dad phone the following morning or that night. They're irate. What do you mean my son is being, my son's never been a problem. Why is my son being put in detention? I don't agree with detention. That's no way to treat children, blah, 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 blah. Dancing up and down, very upset. So in the end, in this, the parents in the end just objected, and so they didn't want little Johnny to do his detention. So whatever, in this circumstance, it was agreed. And then if you feel that strongly about it, and I'll pull my son out and I can go anywhere I want, and then fine, take little Johnny, and he doesn't have to do it. He doesn't have to do detention. So where's your discipline? Where's your response? And where's all the rest of it? I mean, you've basically, cut off the administration's ability to to not to punish the kids. The idea is not to punish kids. I mean, yes, they're supposed to behave in a certain way, but it's to teach them to be adults. Most teachers, when you talk, I spend a lot of time in middle school. Part of what's being done there is to bring young people and help them to grow and learn to be good citizens and productive people, so they can be helpful to themselves and to others as they progress through life. And it's meant to be a combination of parents and teachers and the community working together to ensure that these kids progress as best they can and become the best human beings that they can be. Well, some parents aren't up for that. And so all it takes is a couple of those incidents, and all of a sudden, Mr. and Mrs. X decide they're going to take their kid and they're going to take him to some private institution that will offer them whatever. Some of those private institutions are fine. Some of them are horrendous. So, I visited some that are, there's no discipline at all. It's every man for himself. It's just like completely scattergraphic, whatever. I don't want to get into the details, but it clearly is not, discipline is not the order of the day. If you think you can stand and talk to a teacher for 2 minutes without being interrupted by some 13-year-old with an attitude, then you'd be wrong. But, the parents like it, so that's fine. You go to other private schools, and some of them are great, and some of them are not. That's my whole point. But if you simply say, in the public schools, anytime that a parent doesn't like what's happening in the public schools and decides to pull little Johnny out, then off he goes, and it just isn't it isn't conducive to having a system that is able to bring order, etc., to students. But the most egregious example is these places where the school district or the school itself doesn't have the tools it needs, doesn't have enough people, doesn't have enough books, doesn't have whatever it might be, and into that mix we have a state director of education and a chairman of a state board of education whose concentration is on privatization and homeschooling. This is where we're going to. This is the push we're going to have. I want to hear these people stand up and fight for public education in the state of New Hampshire. I want them to fight for the kids in Berlin and Colebrook and Pittsfield and Walpole and Somersworth and every other town in the state of New Hampshire that are not property-rich towns. And I want them to say that the citizens of New Hampshire who are minors and who need an education are cherished as much in those towns as they are in the wealthiest towns in the state. And clearly in the state of New Hampshire that's not the case. And not alone is it not the case, but our State House and our representatives will do more and more and more to aggravate that problem rather than to alleviate it in one way or the other. I also was reading here in the Union Leader, the contrast with the Concord Monitor shouldn't be lost. Education Commissioner Edelblut stands up for choice. Critics say he's hurting public schools. This is Dave Solomon's article from, I don't know if the date, March 4th. So here this is, as I said, Dave Solomon's report, and he says Commissioner Frank Edelblut has been a lightning rod for controversy from the moment he was nominated by Governor Chris Sununu to lead the Department of Education. Other than Sununu, he has the most prominent public profile of any leader in the executive branch, and that should come as no surprise. He came within 1,000 votes of beating Sununu for the 2016 GOP Republican gubernatorial nomination out of more than 100,000 votes cast. in a four-way race. During the primary campaign, Edelblut positioned himself as a grassroots social and fiscal conservative who, with his wife, homeschooled their 7 children. His nomination by Sununu drew howls of protest from Democrats and public education advocates who saw his appointment as a way to promote the privatization of education at the expense of public schools. And that's exactly the complaint at the start, and everything he's done since has led one to believe more and more that this is an ideologue who is trying to impose his view on public education. 2 Democrats of the 5-member executive council voted against his nomination, and in early February took the unusual step of voting against a 6.5% pay raise from $93,800 to $99,900, claiming Edelblut had politicized the job and neglected public schools. So, just for my friends here in Manchester who will be fighting hard for a 1.6% tax cap increase per year, and that is more than Mr. Edelblut is getting more than 4 times that as an increase from the state of New Hampshire. He's getting it from the 3 of the 5 executive council members who are Republicans. He's getting it from a Republican governor and a Republican, 2 of the Republican executive. Let's just call it like that's just a statement of fact. I didn't make it up. This is education. We're talking education matters. I'm not going over to talk about what's happening in the Department of Health and Human Services. This is education, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we talk about here. And there are people listening to me who like to call up and say the unions this and teachers are that and we can't afford anymore. One of my well-known speakers in Manchester is constantly talking about we can't afford this and we can't afford that. But there's no problem with Chris Sununu giving 4 times what the students of Manchester will get for education in a pay raise to the guy at the top of the Department of Education. Not because he's done a great job in helping our public schools to get better, but because we think he deserves a 6.5% pay increase. Defend it. I'd love anybody. You want to call up? Tell me why that's a good idea. Especially if you believe that we can't afford it, we're taxed too high already, that our public schools don't deserve any more money, all of those arguments that you have. There's your Republican candidate for governor, now head of the Department of Education in the state of New Hampshire under the Republican government. There's nobody other than a bunch of Republicans in Concord who are voting and choosing to give this man 6.5%. They're not required to do it by law. They're just decided that that's what they'd like to do with your money. Intolerable. If this was done by John Lynch, there would have been hell to pay. How come they're up there in Concord giving Raffio or Mary Heath or whoever their Secretary King or wherever it was 6.5%, and we're down here with classes with 40 kids in it? But no, it's okay now because the shoe's on the other foot. So, also, Mr. Sununu, Mr. Edelblut, they voted because he'd politicized his job and neglected public schools. That's what 2 of the 5 executive council members said. He's the target of a Senate bill designed to forbid commissioners from engaging in any partisan political activity, co-sponsored by 9 of 10 Senate Democrats. For his part, Edelblut says his speaking engagements are nothing out of the ordinary, and the criticism of his tenure ignores many accomplishments in his first year. Well, I don't know about these accomplishments. We're reading the Union Leader, so we'll see. Maybe we'll get to that. I don't think the activities I've been engaged in are inappropriate, he says. I think they're essential in helping to move our education system forward. There is change happening in education. It's important during these times of change that I get out to as many groups as possible to explain what's going on so they can be informed consumers and supporters of the education system in New Hampshire to help us move forward. State Board of Education Chairman Andrew Klein, appointed by Sununu last year, describes Edelblut as more of a technician manager than an ideologue. How about that? Isn't that nice? Yeah, so he's not an advocate for homeschooling, the privatization of education, the funding of religious schools, the elimination of the division between church and state. Those are all positions he holds, and etc. But he's not doing any of that. We just have this, like, he's just a really good manager. He's a financier who does angel funding of startup firms because he's got the money. He used to work for Price Waterhouse Cooper as an accountant. His degree is in accounting. So, and I don't mean to malign Mr. Edelblut, by the way. I mean, I'd like Mr. Edelblut to come by here and sit here any day, and he'll be treated with great respect. This is not about personality, and I've never heard anything about Mr. Edelblut being anything but an upright person. So just to be clear, this is not an ad hominem attack that he is some kind of wicked evil person. It's his policies have the effect of being wicked and evil to some of the children in the state of New Hampshire. That's the point. But back to Mr. Klein, who says that he's just a technician or a manager. So he's going around attending ideologically based groups in the state of New Hampshire, speaking to them about privatization, private schools, homeschooling, and school voucher systems. But oh no, he's just here as a manager. That would be the editor of the Union Leader, its far right-wing conservative editorials for some years. In working with him, I've been impressed with his management style, his attention to detail, and his openness to ideas. That would be ideas other than finding more money for our schools, finding better ways of financing them, and ensuring that kids across the state have got an adequate education. He describes Edelblut, a CPA, business consultant and entrepreneur, as a creative and thoughtful leader who is genuinely focused on making the Department of Education as efficient and effective an organisation as it can be so it can better serve the students of New Hampshire. And by the way, he needs to go from $92,000 to $98,900 per year in order to do that, because, he needs the money. When you're used to being a financier and you've worked for Price Waterhouse Cooper and you've got a massive 401k, how are you going to keep them down on the farm? For a mere $90-some thousand. That extra 6.5%. Let the plebs eat bread. He's going to have some cake, thank you very much. Because he's really concerned, according to Mr. Klein and Governor Sununu, he's really concerned about the children of New Hampshire, but give him an extra 6.5% per year, plus benefits, and he'll be very happy for this year at least with that. Yeah. By the way, a 6.5%, 99. So that's so we're talking about an extra couple of $100, almost a couple of $100 a week. How would you like that for an increase? Take your wife to dinner, maybe someplace nice. Chop House is great. There's lots of nice places to go. Former Board of Education member Bill Duncan, whose term was not renewed by Sununu, has a decidedly different perspective. Duncan sued the state in an unsuccessful attempt to block the 2012 law that gave businesses a tax break if they donated to a scholarship fund for private school tuition. By the way, that's a bill that's long forgotten. It's there, and and in this case, what happens is if I've got a business in the state of New Hampshire, and I owe taxes of $100,000, or let's say $10,000. I can decide to give $9,900 of that as a scholarship for a kid to go to school, and guess what? I don't have to pay the taxes anymore. So that's even less money for the poor kids of New Hampshire to buy books and desks and pay for teachers, because I've decided I'm going to give it to private people to go to private education for private scholarships in private and religious schools. That got by in New Hampshire without a whimper. Duncan points to several examples. When the legislature authorised a new position to support charter schools, Edelblut advertised for a school choice advocate until the Board of Education intervened. So remember, now we have the state of New Hampshire under Edelblut, who's just a manager, remember, a manager getting an extra 6.5%, but he's just a manager who's got no ideology, etc. But when he advertises for an employee for the state of New Hampshire, he needs a school choice supporting employee. In other words, they advertise using my dollars and yours, taxpayers' money, to bring somebody in who doesn't support public schools but is going to work and be paid for by the public school system and your tax dollar. Somebody who believes in privatization, somebody so they're required as a job coming into the job, whether it's good or not, that this is a privatization job. We want you to bring in here. This is the job you're going to do, and now we're going to pay you to do it. Until the Board of Education intervened. And there are examples all over the place of kids in the state of New Hampshire not getting the services that they need, not having the programs that they deserve, and yet this is the nonsense that we have from these political ideologues, the wolf in sheep's clothing Governor Chris Sununu, who is all smiles and nice about it until it comes to this. Just last week, he sent a letter to the House Finance Committee arguing against limits the committee is considering on a school choice proposal, now working its way through, that's 193. The department's tenacious advocacy for private school choice puts our schools in a very vulnerable position, says Duncan. Public schools will be on defensive as long as this new department policy is in place. We have a call coming in. Oops. Go ahead, sorry, caller, we lost you. Try again. We don't have a lot of time, actually, so if you're calling, you've got like a couple of minutes to do so, or a minute or two. I'm an advocate for options in education for all students and will remain so only because I believe that each student is unique. We need to create educational opportunities that are different for different students so every student can get to the top of their game. Edelblut speaks highly of the state's public school system, its teachers and administrators, and says he has spent countless hours in public and private schools since his appointment. The bulk of students are doing really well in the existing system, he says. It's the students on the margin that we need to create opportunities for. We need to give them alternatives. No, you're very wrong, Mr. Edelblut. First of all, you don't know what you're talking about. That's the first thing. You're not qualified for the position. You're ideologically married to a political ideology that says we need to privatize everything. And the solution is plain and in your face. Our public schools are, in some parts of the state, in many parts of the state, do not have the resources they require. And you don't have to go out and take money away from them and give it to private companies. You don't have to bring in outside management companies from other states to come in and manage things. What you need to do is to go into poor school districts and ensure that they get better funding than they have. And you could start by going to the town of Bow, for instance, and say, look, the state taxes that you collected, the $1.9 million that you collected more than you needed, that $1.9 million is actual state taxes, and we're going to use that, and we're going to give $400,000 to Berlin, $400,000 to Claremont, $400,000 to Somersworth, $400,000 to Pittsfield, or whatever it is, in order that they can hire a few more teachers so that their class sizes aren't so big, or they can have better school offerings. That's buy food for the cafeterias, buy desks, buy books, put the resources into the public schools. Every community in the state of New Hampshire should have a well-functioning, well-maintained school with highly qualified teachers in it, and as a result, happy kids and happy parents. That's the solution. The solution is not to be taking money out of the system every way you can, including your own lousy 6.5%, which is obnoxious of you as a very rich man already, to take that out of the mouths of poor children in New Hampshire, with your fellow ideological enablers up in the state of New Hampshire, led by Chris Sununu. You should not be putting your snout in that trough. You should be working hard for the average man and woman and the children of the state of New Hampshire, doing what is right, not being self-serving and ideological, sitting in the ivory tower. That's my editorial for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Pay attention to this stuff, please. Be conscious of who you're voting for going up into Concord, because it's a mess up there right now with a bunch of people who have no interest in helping you or helping the children of the state of New Hampshire or doing what's right for the children of New Hampshire. What they're there to do is to advance their own political ideas, and many of them that don't bear scrutiny and are based on half facts and nonsense. and they need to be held to account. Simply coming up to your front door and saying, I'll hold the line on taxes, is nonsense, because what they'll actually do is give Mr. Edelblut a 6.5% increase. That's what they'll really do, or do what they did 4 years ago and give the tobacco companies a tax decrease of $30 million. So hold their feet to the fire, make them come up with solutions, not just platitudes. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, tomorrow, Wednesday, March 7th, early closing in the schools in Manchester. Be aware of that. Stay safe in all this snow and weather. St. Patrick's Day is coming up. Looking forward to that. Talk to you all in a week or so. Bye-bye.